Okay, welcome everyone. We're just getting started now. We will be live streaming on YouTube, so it'll be recorded. Just collecting a few more people here before we get started. We're going to be working on a Miro board today. So I invite you to join me there. Here's a link I'll share with you. Hopefully you're familiar with Miro. If not, happy to help you. I'm going to put this link in the chat and you can join whenever ready. Going to have you post out some stickies as we go along. Maybe you're familiar with this. Maybe you were with us last time. Maybe not. We've already done a few sessions here thinking about systems innovation in the context of cities, urban design, urban development. We've started off this series thinking about urban complexity. What does complexity theory mean? When we apply that to thinking about cities, looking at cities, trying to understand them as complex systems. We started about three sessions ago. We've done a bit of work so far. We started here thinking about these things, cities, urban networks. How do we understand them, as I say, from a complexity perspective, as these complex adaptive systems, these networks that evolve and self-organized and emergence and all these ideas, fractals, so on and so forth. We've been talking quite a bit about that. I'll very briefly show you what we've covered in the past. This is probably new to some of you. Here we are. Initially, we talked about urban complexity. What is that? Quite a few different ideas there. We jumped into systems, thinking about a city as a system, a set of interrelated parts, how they work together to enable the overall functioning of the system. Self-organization, what does that look like in terms of urban development? And we touched briefly upon networks, this idea of looking at the city as a network. We're going to talk more about that today. We didn't get much time in that session, so we're going to talk more today. It's an interesting perspective. In the last session, 2 weeks ago or a month ago, we talked about what's the functioning of an urban environment, what's the function? And also thinking about this as a complex adaptive system. So hopefully you're familiar a little bit with complexity theory and some of those ideas. We're going to dig into some more of those today. Continuing this journey of thinking about the city as a complex adaptive system. Today we're going to talk about 3 different things. We've got 1 hour, hopefully enough time, but we're going to talk about the city as a network. We're going to look at this kind of micro-macro dynamic. Maybe you've heard of that, kind of bottom-up versus top-down. Talk more about that and explain what I mean. Evolution in the final section here. How do complex adaptive systems evolve over time and change and so forth. I'll explain a bit more about that as we go along. So here we are on the first one, thinking about the city as a network. This is a nighttime view of central London, and it helps to illustrate the kind of networked nature of cities. So here's another one. It's New York City transport system in all its details. And this is another way of looking at it, right? This is kind of what they're illustrating. This is the Urban Age, a project by LSE, London School of Economics, where they map out the density of different cities around the world. And you can see here, this is obviously just another way of looking at a network, right? This is London here. It's quite low density actually, relative to these other ones, New York and Hong Kong and so forth. Shanghai, Sao Paulo, you can see they have a different kind of structure to them, right? Here, Johannesburg has something with a little bit of a decentralized structure, right? Little clusters here, little clusters as opposed to Mumbai. 2 kind of main structures, clusters, Istanbul, so on and so forth. These are all representations of some underlying structure. This is quite distributed in Sao Paulo too. So that's what we're talking about here initially. I'd like you to join us. We've had some more people joined, so I'm going to share the link again, but we're going to ask the question here. How can a network perspective help us to better understand and develop better urban environments? Also a kind of key question in network analysis is this question of centralization versus decentralization. A really important question. All complex systems have this kind of networked architecture to them. And in all of them, you can ask that question. And it's a very productive question to ask, actually, this question of how centralized or decentralized is the system? What are the benefits of being centralized? What are the benefits of being decentralized? What's the trade-off between them? So I'd encourage you, those are the questions there. What are the results of a decentralized urban network? What are the results of having a centralized urban network? So here's the link again. If you can jump in and grab a sticky and post up any of your ideas on that. This is aimed to be an interactive discussion. If you post up your stickies, and then we can have a discussion about what we mean by this networked approach to cities and whether we think they're better centralized or decentralized. So it works. If you need help, just let me know. You just grab a sticky here and you plonk it down and you type in whatever you think on this topic. So let's take a couple of minutes to do that before we come back and continue the discussion. Okay, let's take a quick look at what we've come up with. You can stay typing away and posting your stickies up if you wish, but we're going to jump in to talk about some of these. So, creates opportunities for co-benefit in interdependent infrastructure systems. Creates opportunities for co-benefits in interdependent infrastructure systems. Who is this? Is this replying to the benefits of centralization? Or? Anybody want to talk on this? Lara, yeah?
Yes. So basically understanding it answers the network perspective and like thinking of the city as a whole system. Basically, it allows you to identify whether there are infrastructure that can be co-located, for instance. Like, for example, you can have energy production and food production in one system. So you eliminate the need to have multiple if you can just have them in one infrastructure system.
Yeah, I think maybe you're talking about synergies too, aren't you?
Yes.
Because we touched upon that quite a bit in the past, actually, talking about synergies instead of when we talked about a holistic approach. A kind of reductionist approach kind of separates things out, doesn't it? Whereas maybe a holistic approach puts them together and looks at the kind of synergies you can get when you co-locate and the benefits from that. Okay, thank you. Mutual agreements. What's this? Anybody want to speak on that? Mutual agreements? New
Hi, George.
cities? Yep.
Yeah, it was me. Yeah.
What are you thinking?
So I was thinking about how different parts of cities do their connections and build their connections. So it, I think the network perspective brings the mutual agreements when we are trying to make productive out of the like synergies, when we are into synergies and we are trying to build the productive nature of, yeah. So like mutual agreement is help us to stay in what we all want to have in common.
Yeah, it's a good idea. It's more of a kind of a economic or social perspective, isn't it, rather than a kind of physical infrastructure. It makes me think about things like charter cities, or economic trade-free zones. You know, some places we've created these agreements, economic kind of political agreements, and then out of that has sprung, you know, in Shanghai and other places, in Shenzhen and so on. They create these set of rules around trade-free agreements and so forth, and then out of that pretty quickly pops, you know, rapid economic can develop very rapid economic development. So it's, as you say, it's partly about the rules, people getting together, having mutual agreements and certain rules, and then very quickly a network can kind of pop out of that, can't it?
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting, and it's interesting. The whole charter city concept. I'm not sure if many of us are that familiar with it. It's kind of an extension of, you know, we've seen many of these cities grow very rapidly, these economic trade-free zones that tapped into globalization, attracted a lot of resources, and then bam, very quickly started building out all this infrastructure and so forth. And the kind of charter city is an extension of that, saying, well, couldn't we just come up with a set of rules, a charter around how we want to get together, these kind of mutual agreements and so forth, and then would be able to set up a city kind of anywhere. I think they're thinking of this in Honduras and other places. It's quite an interesting concept. Anyway, thank you, Alhaz. New cities versus old cities, i.e. grid planning versus organic growth. Yep. So these networks, they're very kind of organic, aren't they, in a way, when you look at them. and the way many networks evolve, they aren't that planned, really. We'll talk more about that in a minute, top down versus bottom up. But many networks, like trade routes, those trade routes that kind of developed around the world, trading between ancient trade routes between East Asia and Europe, they just evolved out of people, getting into their ship and going to another part of the world and trading with them, seeing the benefits of that over time. These networks of trade routes across the planet emerged, right? No one actually planned those. There was no government. And cities are very much like that too. Many networks are like that. Does anybody want to speak on this kind of organic new cities versus old grid planning, organic growth?
Yeah. Hey, Joss, James Snellgrove, and hi everyone. Great to be on the call. Yeah, I just think it's interesting, isn't it, when you look at these satellite views as well. You can see like a city like London, it's just grown organically around the river location and sort of spread out. Versus a newer city, and take something like New York, which is the grid system clearly. And I think, yeah, as you were saying, Joss, it's interesting, isn't it? It's like, I guess a city which grows more organically can maybe kind of accept change more easily, potentially, whereas something which is kind of grid planned in a short amount of time might kind of inherently build in, biases which we have, and may be less able to adapt over time. So that might be something to think about. Yeah,
and this thing here, right? Over 2,000 years old, Londinium. You see this bridge here, this one here, London Bridge. That was the original one crossing this bay here when the Romans came and they set up their little trading post here. That was over 2,000 years ago, and this thing has evolved through many iterations, the coming and going of the Romans and different kings and queens and the Industrial Revolution and so on. Now we're in the information age and so forth. And it's learned many things over that period. And this whole city got destroyed almost pretty much after the Romans, and it almost got destroyed again in the Great Fires, I think it was. And it's been, and of course, it got bombed into almost, the Blitzkrieg during the Second World War. It's been through many iterations compared to, Dubai or somewhere like that. Do we have pictures of something like Dubai here? I'm not sure we do. But that's, a city like Dubai or Shenzhen, Shenzhen 40 years ago, it was a little fishing village of, 80,000 people. Now it's a mega city of 18,000 people or something, in the space of 40 years. And that's all been built upon our understanding of the world right now and what works right now in this context of globalization. So exactly as you say, what happens when things change? And they definitely will change. It doesn't have that history. Lots of benefits, lots of disadvantages to that also. Like we're talking about in Saudi Arabia, they're setting up new cities there, right? It's very simple for them just to build a city out there in the desert and do it from scratch, and many advantages to that, the line or the circle or whatever it's going to be called. Try and do that here in Europe, not so easy. Got all this history, got all these little boroughs, and they're all worried about their little thises and that's and their history and so forth. So advantages and disadvantages, but very interesting, right? How it evolves, how it learns things through that evolution. And that definitely contributes to its kind of resilience and so forth. Okay, so helps to review socioeconomic distribution. The influence of city planners, architects, redevelopment, agendas, etc. Yeah, we'll be talking more about this in a minute. The physical location of key organizations and institutions. Yeah, it goes a little bit back to this charter thing, doesn't it? Certain people want to cluster together. In here, we have certain clusters. Obviously, financial center is here. They want to all kind of cluster together. They also cluster together out here in Canary Wharf. We have all the technology people, a lot of them kind of clustering around here in Tech City and East London. And now we've got a knowledge quarter going on up here. They want to cluster together. King's College, and then we've got all the Google people and all the tech companies that want to cluster around there also. So it's again about people wanting to get together and kind of form agreements, form clusters and so forth.
Just on that, I think there's
one.
something interesting about identity as well. So just thinking again about the history of London in this map, some people will know, but London was a series of little towns which then got kind of assumed into a larger metropolitan area. So you've got like Camden Town and Greenwich Village. These were little towns and villages on the outskirts of what was then the City of London, which is still called the City of London. But now it has an identity as a large metropolitan city. And you get people from older generations who very much, see themselves as being from East London or from Camden Town, and that's where they identify themselves. Whereas where you get a sort of newer influx of people, they might see themselves as being part of an identity which is much more broader, kind of London identity. And I think that's kind of interesting about where people place themselves and where they sort of, which sort of tribes they align to. I maybe assume that in newer cities, people have less of a kind of specific identity within the city, but they kind of accept it more as a whole.
Yeah, sure. Okay, transport, links and road layouts, the physical location of the key organizations, so forth, more urban traffic. What are the results of decentralization can be both positive and negative. Positive in easing congestion, potentially, and negative in promoting urban sprawl and fragmented urban forms. Anybody want to speak on this?
Hi, Jos. Yeah, that was me. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I think it's it also depends on the context, geographic context, and the demographical context you're dealing with. So, you would find that, so in the South African context, if you look at Johannesburg, I think that's a good example where you have business centers, decentralized business centers. I actually saw a TED talk once where they were talking about e-mobility and also the whole concept of self-driving cars. And the speaker was talking about the fact that he believes that urban sprawl will explode if you one day have a car that drives itself while you can work in your car and not drive it yourself. So he finds that longer commuting times would be possible if you can sit and work in your car while it drives itself. But anyway, so that's besides the point, really. So what I think is, like I said, there's a positive and a negative to this, I believe. I think most certainly in the context of COVID, it'll be interesting to see how we go forward in terms of the architecture of the city, and how working from home will redefine the form of cities, certain cities. Obviously, again, it depends on the context. But would we find, I mean, people are talking about a lot about that it might happen that people don't go back to the city. I don't think it would be the case. LSE did a very good talk on it. I think it was Ricky Baudet who said that people will eventually return to the city, but it will look different, right? A lot of people will keep on working from home, but if they do decide to go back to the city, what may the new city look like? May companies decide that actually it's working well for people to work from home? So what if we decentralize office space, find cheaper locations outside of the city, where people are closer to home, and can almost have the best of both sides, really. Shorter commuting times, being close to home, but also being able to work face to face in the city. I believe solely working from home or distance working isn't healthy in itself. I believe it's good for people mentally as well to be able to collaborate face to face and communicate face to face. So it'll be interesting, like I said, to see how the city evolves from here on forward, post-COVID.
Yeah, and also they talk about this relationship a lot in the context of sustainability, sustainable cities. Actually, in this report here by LSE and the Urban Age, they're looking at this density, and a lot of what they're talking about is, well, what is the best density in terms of trying to develop a sustainable city? And the good examples they give is one of Atlanta, which is a massive sprawling thing. It's spread out of a vast space relative to something like Hong Kong, which is obviously highly compressed like that. And, a key kind of point they're making is that these cities, places like Atlanta, and I think Barcelona is a little bit similar. There's a few others that are spread out over very vast areas, and that really, it's difficult to get a certain efficiency. There's a certain density can create efficiencies, obviously in terms of transport and so forth. But their kind of argument is that you need to get these high density cities actually can be much more sustainable if you design them properly. They can be much more efficient. But I think it's, as you say, there's aspects of, I think that a lot of the consensus has kind of converged around, it will be a bit more like this. It will be decentralized, but then there'll be centralized nodes within that, because there are advantages of high density clusters, but you also want to decentralize it. So the idea is that what were previously kind of centralized places will evolve to look a bit more like this. They'll become larger urban areas, and that's been happening, I think, over the past 30 years or so. Larger urban areas, as transport gets more effective, so you can have high speed transport between here and there, so you can actually get very quickly. We've seen it, but then you have these distributed nodes with high density clusters. So you kind of get the benefits of both to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Oleg.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just to add to that quickly, I think then we get into the space of self-similarity as well, which is another interesting concept of complex systems. Self-similarity in fractal geometry, seeing how these decentralized nodes, are self-similar to the wider systems, which is also a very interesting concept.
Yeah, and we talked about this here, right, in this kind of a map, where you can see these small little networks. If it was high resolution, you'd see these small networks, and they cluster into larger ones, and you, as you say, you get that fractal self-similar scaling. So, Oleg?
Yes. Well, actually, I think is pretty pertinent to introduce the theme of the smart cities in the management of cities. And in particular, I'm recently studying and deepening the paradigm of the digital twin, which I believe is a very powerful tool for urban planning and management as well. I don't know if any of you actually came across this topic at all, but I would be very, very keen on introducing it as maybe a thread somehow, even after this meeting.
Yep, great. We will definitely get to topics around smart city in the future. Definitely something we'll be covering. Yeah, welcome your contributions. So Rebecca, do you want to say something?
Hello, you all. Thank you so much. I just want to add a thing about decentralized cities. A thing that happened here in Brazil was that our big polo is São Paulo, but because of the pandemic, quarantine, some people came to study and work in home office. And what these people did was to get out of this tiny apartment on the center of the city and start to go to like countryside and work as they were working on São Paulo. So it was super good to see the centralized thing.
And São Paulo has a big housing problem too. It has a big congestion problem. Everybody coming into the center, they can't afford, it's very expensive to live in the center of São Paulo. They live on the outskirts. You get a massive amount of commuting into the center. So there's a serious congestion problem in São Paulo. So, I mean, it's amazing to see those changes, isn't it? And hopefully we'll be able to build upon them as we go forward. Okay, great. So let's move on. Did we capture everything there? Let's see what else we've got. Redundancy, potentially good in case of disruption. Yep. So this kind of resilience, which we haven't really talked about, maybe we'll get to this in the future and talk more about resilience and so forth. Chain reaction would stop in decentralized networks at the time of chaos. Yep, that's definitely decentralized networks. They're known to be more resilient. They aren't as dependent upon centralized nodes, so on and so forth. They have greater redundancy, as someone says there. Okay, so centralized urban environment may promote densified development depending on the transport infrastructure. Yep, so there are definitely advantages to this centralization, economies of scale and so forth. Agglomeration. Yep. Okay, for the sake of time, let's stay moving on. The second board, we want to talk about this kind of bottom down versus bottom up versus top down, excuse me. We call it micro-macro dynamic in systems theory. It's how the structure on the macro level shapes and conditions the rules on the micro level, but then the interactions on the micro level then give rise to patterns on the macro level. So this is continuous kind of feedback loop between the micro and macro, and kind of tensions and challenges that it creates. Couple of little quotes here. The current dominant paradigm of contemporary infrastructure design is that of Hugasian large-scale technical systems, LTS. However, we see unprecedented infrastructures emerging that are not owned by governments or large businesses. They're not governed centrally or controlled top-down by government or industry, as telecommunications, energy networks, and railways, for example, have been for decades, right? So it's obviously been the dominant paradigm, this large-scale technical systems as to how we do things. Instead, so we're talking about change now, instead they are owned and developed by the individual citizens of small businesses, yet managed to mushroom into local, regional, and even global infrastructures. The examples are Wikipedia, networks of privately owned solar energy systems, and citywide Wi-Fi networks. These user-driven, self-organizing, decentralized infrastructures, or inverse infrastructure. I don't know if you come across that concept. It's an interesting one, inverse infrastructure. We think of infrastructure as something big and heavy that governments and so forth do. These LTSs, this reverse infrastructure is the opposite way around. It says, actually, we can create infrastructure like a Wi-Fi network in Berlin is a good example, where people share their Wi-Fi. They set up an antenna on their roof and they're able to share it with other people, and they're creating that telecommunications infrastructure in a bottom-up reverse infrastructure way, as they say. So it reflects a radical alternative to the model of complex LTSs. So that's the idea of kind of not all infrastructure has to be done in a top-down way. When we look at building the resilience of a system, it is that you want to be enabling self-organization as you see it in nature. That kind of connected organic growth that you see in nature. Getting back to the resilience idea, the bottom up, and it goes a bit back to this London thing, right? That you're talking about there, James. All these little hamlets, these little towns, kind of came together, didn't they? And actually, they're still here. I live in Wapping, just here in front of me, and it's a little town, really. And there's a whole part of other little towns, and they kind of came together in a bottom up, very organic way. That's a bit different to some other cities in Europe. You know, in Paris, for example, they had a massive kind of top-down plan system back in the 1800s, got rid of a lot of the kind of quirky streets and so forth, and put in these big boulevards and so forth. So there's a lot of kind of top-down planning there. Anyway, where are we here? And we want to talk about this top-down versus bottom-up. So top-down is this kind of cybernetics, actually it's called. It's about kind of control systems. We have someone there in the center. They come up with a plan. They have some logic, and there's a system, and they're able to act to shape that system. as they see fit according to their plan, and then they get feedback about how it's going and they adjust it and so forth. That's a regulatory or control system, a centralized way of organizing and planning from the top down. This here is a bottom-up approach, self-organization, how through the interaction between initially disordered elements, we get positive feedback and it builds into attractors. So kind of like marketplaces are a bit like this. A few people throw up their stall somewhere, and then some people go there to buy their products, and then other people see that the people are going there to buy things, so they say, oh, I'll put my stall there also because other people are coming to buy things. A few other people join with their stalls, and then we start to go to the market, and everyone knows, oh, that's where you go to buy your fruit or whatever, and you get more people going there. And that's a bottom-up self-organizing process instead of someone saying, let's have a market there in a kind of planned way. Those are two different paradigms to how kind of order can emerge in a system. And this here, obviously a very kind of planned system. I believe this was the government buildings in Hong Kong, is it? Or park or something, I'm not sure exactly where it was, obviously in Hong Kong. And it's obviously a very kind of planned, it's a highly regulated, controlled environment. The space is obviously very, very expensive, premium space, it's top down. So what's the relationship between top-down planning and bottom-up processes of emergence? That's what we want to think about here. We can see here, this is a bit different. This is a kind of a user-generated thing, right? No one's actually telling those people where to go as they cross that street. There's some structure there, but they're deciding, you know, generally where they walk and so forth. And that emerges actually out of the interaction between the parts, because they don't want to bump into each other. They're going to choose particular ways to walk there. It's a certain process of self-organization. And we know some cities develop like that, the favelas or other informal urban settlements. People just show up and pitch up a shed or whatever, and the city develops like that. Other ones, they develop like this. Let's grab some stickies and post up any ideas you have on this bottom-up versus top-down idea to urban development. We'll take a few minutes to do that. Just drop this down. I'll share the link again for newcomers. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these. What we got here, community stakeholder consultation can inform urban design and policies. Anybody want to speak on this?
That's me again.
Mm.
I've been working for multiple government agencies in the Philippines, in Australia, and in Japan. So usually the process is, it always starts with community consultation or stakeholder consultation. And that's what you use to identify the objectives of the project. So it can be similar in the sense that the way cities plan now are increasingly based on what people need rather than coming from the top.
And how well do you think that works in your experience?
Well, there's usually a framework that tells people like this is like the public participation framework, which is used to identify like the level of engagement that people are involved in the project. So for example, usually it's not about like they don't ultimately decide on what policies or what design interventions are going to be used, but it does form some sort of accountability in the public sector that what they're investing in is actually what people need.
So it's kind of City Hall is deciding the outlines of, for example, they decided that there's going to be a park here or whatever it is.
Yes.
And then within that, the citizens are given scope to say what kind of park they want or something.
Yes. So another example is here in Barcelona, there's a website specifically for people to vote on policies or really just for stakeholder consultation.
Barcelona is pretty good for this sort of stuff, isn't it? It's got a
Yes.
lot of people doing interesting stuff in terms of technology and so forth. Okay, thank you. So relationship is, they both happen at the same time. Kind of co-evolution of top down and bottom up. Anybody want to speak on this?
Hey, it's me again.
Hey.
So yeah, I think both the approaches are, I think, are the approaches we are being using, and or I would say that system is adaptive to the both approaches at the same time, and so that gives me one or another thread to how these combination of the both approaches lead to where are we right now, or are we planning to how we are balancing these both approaches to make a better outcome. For example, you have shared this control system over here, which is a top-down approach to control the environment. But same system when we go deeper into each an element, which is are done in the bottom-up approach, using the bottom-up approach. So yeah, we are pretty much doing the both approach while creating the systems. But what is the balance between these is the, I think, the key factors which.
Yeah, for sure. And the idea in complexity theory is that you need balance between two. Actually, bottom-up approaches lead to a kind of suboptimal outcome, really. If people are just doing based upon their local kind of incentives and interactions, no one's looking out for the whole. So it engages people and brings in their energy, brings in their local information and so forth in developing it all. But ultimately, you can end up in a suboptimal, when you have someone looking out for the whole and kind of planning on that level, they're trying to optimize it on that level. So both of them have benefits and advantages and disadvantages. And I think it is a question of getting balance between the two. Obviously, you know, some of those cities in China, very top down planning and so forth, other places in Latin America and so forth, very much bottom up. And I think it's really about trying to get the synergy between the two. That's the idea, one of the ideas in complexity theory, the edge of chaos, that complex adaptive systems to evolve and adapt and sustain themselves over a prolonged period of time. They have to maintain themselves on an edge of chaos, which is the space in between too much order and too much randomness and chaos. So if you think about it, kind of, if you look at those cities in China, they're very orderly. They're exceptionally orderly, right? And actually very ordered systems. You look at other ones, some of those in South America, you know, in Lima or wherever it is in Sao Paulo, and they're pretty, you know, you go to the favelas and it's all over the place, really. So there's that interplay between order and disorder, and how do you kind of manage that and make it work in the most productive way?
Yeah, right.
So bottom-up planning can produce more equitable outcomes. Anybody want to speak on that?
That's a key part of why community consultation is integrated into urban planning, just so that, yeah, policies and design interventions are really based on people's needs, rather than the government dictating where public investment is. So going back to your China example, there are a lot of ghost cities in China, just because people are not really moving into these places. So they're used, I think, as an economic vehicle so that it stimulates the housing market. But not everyone can afford to live in these cities. So when people inform design or policies, then they can, yeah, it can produce more equitable outcomes.
Yeah, I'd question whether it produces more. It can be more driven by the real needs, I think, as you say.
Yeah.
Does it really create more equitable outcomes? Anybody else want to talk about that? I'm not sure if it does.
Yeah, it's very,
I think
the intention is
debatable.
there, but in terms of actual delivery, then yeah.
Yeah. I think, but go on, James.
Yeah, sorry, Josh. Yeah, I think it also depends on the context, you know, the political context as well. I think, you know, especially community engagement is extremely important, especially if you look at the global south, and because it's really a focus on what people need at a micro level, you know, which isn't always picked up by local government or national government at a macro scale. So I think it's extremely important, but it also depends on the level of you know, political involvement and the, you know, the different aspirations behind it. I mean, you know, there's no point in having stakeholder engagement or community engagement if it's not really taken on board. So I think it's the whole idea is extremely important, but it really depends on the context, I think. Yeah.
And this question of equitable outcomes, any ideas on that? Do you think it creates, having that input can create more equitable outcomes, or?
I just wanted to say, I think there can be that challenge of like sort of tyranny of the masses or something like that. And you know, I've worked with within the local administration here in Bristol, and I think if you get a good administration, that there will be people who are very much looking out for this kind of unheard voices as well. So sometimes, you know, it depends on how good the kind of consultation you're doing is. But there's always people who are kind of exception to the rule. And so designing with that in mind would be the kind of best way of trying to get to, you know, the best form of equitable outcomes, I think.
I would like to say, yeah.
Yep.
I think the bottom-up planning is more, for me, more suitable when we are doing the initial order and we are making the initial route and initial, you can say, the base of the planning. But when we try to see the whole picture and try to where the planning is goes, and to see the neighborhood of the planning also, when we want the organization also be resilient to their neighborhood to see the whole picture. When the bottom planning seem to uh, inequitable for me, because you have planned all the organization from the bottom approach, but you are not linking to this to the neighbor of the organization also. For example, like I'm just talking about in the city level planning, when we are doing the decentralized form of settlements, but we have to see the what is the nature of the neighborhood of your decentralized network, because it helps to build the relationship between the and the
Yeah.
resilience between the neighborhood organization to come up the whole city level uh, outcome. So it depends upon what the outcomes you are looking for. You are looking for the initial outcome to see the core organization work, or you are looking for the how the feedback are going on there within the organization as well as the whole system. Yeah.
Okay. Where are you, Alhaz? In India somewhere? No?
Yes, right now I'm in India.
Okay. Certain situation there in India too. I mean, every place around the planet is different, isn't it? So top-down tends to build in the bias and constraints of the era. Yep, it's a few people, isn't it? Top-down kind of, it's going to be done in a centralized way. There's going to be a few people, and they're going to have limited diversity in that. Obviously, this bottom-up approach can incorporate a lot of diversity and maybe overcome those kind of biases. So here, a playbook, a playable city in which citizens have greater control over how they interact with infrastructure and services. Is this you, James? Or?
Yeah, was good guess. Yeah, I mean, it's just a concept. I think in Bristol, it's kind of. I think it might have been a global program around sort of playable cities, and that was much more around just kind of fun ways of interacting with different areas within the city and art installations and things like that. But kind of links into that other green post-it note which I put in around opening up and valuing city data as a public good. And enabling citizens to access, data about their city, so they can, have more informed choices about what they're doing or how they're interacting with the city, and kind of enabling new innovations around things like, use of that data and app development and things like that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big theme, isn't it? We'll talk about smart cities in the future, but in the past, we thought about cities a lot in terms of these physical things. And if we wanted to change the city, we kind of had to change something physical. But now, all this information, you could change things just by giving people different information, and you can change their behavior and patterns. And from that, change the way the city operates and so forth. You can do so much with information. And we're going to move into a more and more kind of virtual, hybrid, virtual reality sort of world, aren't we? And that's going to come to cities too. Talked about this digital twin idea, and then that offers so much possibilities for playable cities where people could see, shape things in the virtual world, and then see maybe how they could play out in reality. But it's a whole new paradigm, isn't it? Data, opening data up, giving it to people, and you can change behavior and change the way the system really operates. So breaking the rules or breaking the way to do standard way of doing. Anybody want to speak on this? Breaking the rules or breaking the way to do standard way of doing?
Again, it's me, Nosh. So I was thinking about the system as in the Siphon framework, when we have the different complexities and the complex and the chaotic and the standard systems. So what I was thinking about, we have built more and more standard way of doing things, become more orderly, the order system, but we have more in terms of the complexity and the complex system. So when we human tries to break the standard way of doing system, it leads to some of the complex environment or the chaotic environment, but as well as it leads to one of the automated environment. For me, it is a natural way of I think the natural way of doing the human things.
Yeah.
So when you break the standard way, you will achieve the one of the system which is can be the chaotic, but as well as you will become the automated, which to result your the best efficiency and the productivity of the system.
So it's interesting, like this theme of rules, isn't it? Think of a city as a set of rules. And then when you think about that, you can think about
Constraints,
changing the rules and breaking the rules and see what happens if you change those rules. And we're also kind of moving into this more algorithmic world, right? The smart city, it's a whole pile of algorithms and data. And then you can start playing with, algorithms are rules. So you can start playing, and also you can have this blockchain, decentralized smart contract kind of world, which are a set of rules also. And then you can stop thinking about the city so much as kind of concrete and steel and a set of rules. I think that's a lot of where we kind of started this conversation around a charter city. And these economic free zones that have been so successful, Dubai, as I say, Shenzhen, so on, Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong. These are kind of really they're these economic free zones, but they're kind of charter cities where people just went there and they said, okay, we've got a bit of space now, we've got a bit of freedom from the old rules, and we've got some sand here in Dubai or whatever, and let's create a set of rules here that maybe work for us, enabling us to coordinate ourselves productively in economic and social ways and then out of that kind of emerges the whole city, right? It's actually a different paradigm. It's really kind of thinking about the rules, and then we change the rules, we get the rules right here, and you can just start throwing up, skyscrapers and laying down tarmac all over the place like they did in China. They changed the rules there, didn't they? They shift from kind of a communist to a more market-driven system, and created those trade-free zones, and then things started really exploding, and we built all these cities. And very interesting, right? Particularly when we think about all of this information technology now starting to pervade our cities, smart contracts and algorithms and everything.
Right.
So great, guys. We've hit the end of the hour. We only made it through 2 boards, but we'll keep the conversation going next time. Thank you all very much for joining, and really interesting discussion. Looking forward to the next one. We'll do another one in about a month from now, and we're kind of over time moving more from this kind of theoretical urban complexity stuff, and we'll get into the more kind of practical stuff like smart cities and sustainable cities and so on and so forth. But really interesting conversations when we take these ideas and try to think about what it looks like in the context of cities. Thank you all very much for joining, and I hope to see you again in a month's time. Bye now.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.